August 6th, 1945. 8:30 in the morning. Tokyo. Deep beneath the Imperial General Headquarters, where fluorescent lights buzzed against concrete walls, and the humid summer air felt thick enough to choke on. Staff officers in sweat-stained khaki uniforms hunched over communication boards, moving pins across massive war maps that showed an empire shrinking day by day. 4 years of total war had brought them to this, defending the home islands with whatever they had left. General Korechika Anami, Japan's war minister, strode through those underground corridors with the bearing of a man who'd never tasted defeat. At 58, his weathered face carried absolute confidence in Japan's divine destiny. Victory wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The emperor himself had ordained it. The morning briefing should have been routine. Overnight reports from garrison commanders across the home islands. Updates on Operation Ketsugo, the massive defense preparations designed to make any American invasion so catastrophically costly that Washington would sue for peace rather than sacrifice another 1,000,000 men on Japanese beaches. But something was terribly wrong. The communication board for the Chugoku military district showed nothing. No morning reports from Hiroshima's 2nd General Army Headquarters. No updates from the 400,000 civilians and military personnel in Japan's 8th largest city. Just silence. Radio operators twisted their dials frantically, hearing only static where there should have been the familiar crackle of field reports. "Sir," a young communications officer stammered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the underground cool. "We've lost all contact with Hiroshima, all military frequencies, all civilian radio. Everything went silent at approximately 8:15 this morning." Anami's dark eyes narrowed. In 4 years of total war, entire cities didn't simply vanish from the communication grid. Not cities with major military headquarters. Not cities that were reporting normal defensive preparations just hours ago. What force on earth could instantly silence 340,000 people? To understand what happened next, and why it took 3 more days and a second atomic bomb before Japan would surrender, you have to understand the mindset of 6 men who genuinely believed they held the keys to victory, even as American B-29s turned their cities to ash night after night. They called themselves the Supreme War Council, the Big Six. General Korechika Anami, T. Admiral Suunu Toyoda, General Yoshijiro Umezu, Prime Minister Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai. 6 men. 70 million lives hanging in the balance. But here's what made them so dangerously confident, so resistant to surrender, even when their empire was burning. They knew secrets the Americans couldn't possibly imagine. Since 1940, Japan had been racing to build its own atomic bomb. 2 separate programs. The Army's NIGO project under Dr. Yoshio Nishina. The Navy's FGO program under Dr. Bunsaku Arakatsu. These weren't amateur efforts run by hopeful physicists in basement laboratories. Nishina was one of the world's leading nuclear scientists, a man who'd worked directly with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, who understood the theoretical foundations of atomic fission better than almost anyone alive. And that knowledge had taught him something crucial. Building atomic bombs was virtually impossible. The uranium enrichment alone required industrial facilities beyond imagination. Massive electromagnetic separation plants. Thousands of tons of uranium ore. Electrical power consumption that would drain entire regions. Japan's leading scientists had calculated that even the mighty United States, with its untouched industrial base, its vast resources, could produce perhaps 1 or 2 atomic weapons at most. Maybe 3, if they'd started earlier than anyone suspected. So when the morning reports began filtering in from Hiroshima, scattered, contradictory, barely believable, the military leaders dismissed them with the confidence of men who possessed superior knowledge. A small number of B-29s attacked Hiroshima with a new type bomb, read the first coherent report from a reconnaissance plane. Considerable damage observed. Admiral Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, barely looked up from his strategic maps. Considerable damage from a few bombers. He'd survived the massive B-29 raids that had already destroyed 42 major Japanese cities. Probably a concentrated incendiary attack, he muttered. The Americans are getting more efficient. But as the hours passed, the reports grew stranger. Train schedules to Hiroshima had been indefinitely suspended. Military communications remained completely severed. Most unsettling of all, a weather reconnaissance plane reported seeing something unprecedented, a mushroom-shaped cloud rising nearly 40,000 feet into the sky. Then came President Truman's radio announcement, transmitted by shortwave and picked up by Japanese monitors. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Did your parents or grandparents serve in World War II? What stories did they tell you about those final days? Drop a comment below, and if you're finding this deep dive into history compelling, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter now more than ever. The silence in the Supreme War Council meeting room was deafening. General Anami finally spoke, his voice carrying the studied calm of a career military officer who'd faced death 100 times and never blinked. The Americans are engaged in psychological warfare. Even if they've developed some form of atomic device, the technical requirements make mass production impossible. Our own research confirms this. Toyota nodded grimly. If the Americans possessed an arsenal of such weapons, they would have used them months ago. This is clearly a desperate gambit, perhaps their only such device. What they couldn't know, what their brilliant scientific expertise had blinded them to, was that they were fighting an enemy that had redefined the possible itself. The Manhattan Project had employed 130,000 workers across multiple states. It consumed more electricity than entire nations. It represented the largest secret industrial undertaking in human history, costing nearly $2 billion, roughly $30 billion in today's money. The Japanese military leaders were making decisions based on what they knew was possible. But America had already accomplished the impossible. As August 6th turned to August 7th, as the first horrifying details began arriving from investigation teams rushing toward Hiroshima's ruins, these 6 men clung to their certainty with the desperation of drowning sailors grasping at debris. They had no idea their entire world was about to shatter. Dr. Yoshio Nishina had seen the theoretical calculations. He understood better than almost any human being alive what an atomic bomb could do, in theory. But theory and reality are separated by a chasm that can only be crossed through direct experience. On August 7, 1945, Nishina crossed that chasm. The train journey from Tokyo to the ruins of Hiroshima took 11 hours through a landscape that seemed increasingly surreal. For miles before reaching the city, Nishina could see trees stripped of leaves, telephone poles snapped like matchsticks, and a strange, acrid smell that burned his nostrils like nothing he'd ever encountered. Then the train stopped. The tracks ahead had been twisted into impossible spirals by forces that defied comprehension. Nishina walked the final 5 miles into what had been Hiroshima died. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he found. Buildings hadn't just collapsed. They had been vaporized. Human shadows were burned permanently into concrete walls. Ghostly outlines of people who'd been walking to work when 8:15 a.m. became the last moment they would ever experience. The epicenter, where the bomb had detonated 1,900 feet above ground, was a perfect circle of absolute destruction extending for miles in every direction. Everything within that circle had simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. But most haunting of all were the survivors. Nishina, a man who'd dedicated his life to the pursuit of scientific knowledge, who'd worked alongside the greatest minds in physics, found himself face to face with radiation sickness, a phenomenon that had existed only in theoretical papers until that moment. Victims whose skin was literally falling off their bodies. People vomiting blood, hair falling out in clumps. The walking dead stumbling through ruins that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Nishina's hands trembled as he took measurements with his Geiger counter, the clicking growing frantic as he approached ground zero. This wasn't just an explosive device. This was the fundamental forces of the universe. The same forces that powered the sun, unleashed on a human city. Everything he thought he knew about the limits of atomic weapons had been utterly, catastrophically wrong. He rushed back to Tokyo to deliver his report to the Supreme War Council. The bomb was real. It was devastating beyond comprehension, and Japan had no defense against it. But even his eyewitness testimony wasn't enough to break through their certainty, because they still believed America could only have one bomb, maybe two, at absolute most. They were about to learn how wrong they were. August 9th, 1945. 11:02 in the morning. The Big Six were finally meeting to discuss the Hiroshima reports, when an aide burst into the conference room with a message that drained the color from every face present. Nagasaki has been attacked with another atomic bomb. The room fell silent except for the sound of Admiral Toyoda's pen clattering onto the mahogany table. Another bomb. Just 3 days later. In that moment, every assumption the Japanese military leadership had clung to disintegrated like paper in flames. If the Americans had 2 atomic bombs, they could have 3, or 10, or 100. The entire foundation of Japan's defensive strategy, bleed the Americans so severely during the invasion that they'd negotiate for peace, had just become meaningless. Why would America invade when they could simply erase Japanese cities from existence, one by one, until nothing remained but radioactive wasteland? But even faced with this apocalyptic reality, General Anami couldn't surrender his vision of honorable death over dishonored survival. Would it not be wondrous, he asked, his voice carrying an eerie poetry, for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower? The other council members stared at him in stunned silence. Here was a man so committed to the warrior's code that he would choose national extinction over national surrender. In his mind there was something pure, something aesthetically perfect, about Japan disappearing in atomic fire rather than bowing before foreign occupiers. 3 votes for surrender. 3 votes to continue fighting, even against atomic annihilation. They were deadlocked. And then reality intruded in the most devastating way possible. On August 10th, the Japanese military captured an American fighter pilot named Marcus McDilda, shot down 2 days after Hiroshima Day. Under interrogation, which included torture, MC Dilda provided information that would finally shatter the Japanese military's resistance. The problem was, McDilda knew absolutely nothing about atomic bombs. He was a conventional fighter pilot who'd never been briefed on nuclear weapons, never been anywhere near the Manhattan Project. But faced with torture and desperate to survive, he told his captors what he thought they wanted to hear, embellishing every detail he could imagine. The Americans, McDilda claimed, had over 100 atomic bombs. They could drop 3 per day. Tokyo would be next, followed by Kyoto, then Osaka. Every major Japanese city would be obliterated within weeks. None of this was true. In reality, the United States had exactly 0 atomic bombs remaining. The next weapon wouldn't be ready until late August, and production was painfully slow. If Japan had called America's bluff and fought on, it would have been weeks before another atomic attack was possible. But McDilda's desperate lies contained just enough technical-sounding detail to be believable to interrogators grasping for any information about this incomprehensible new weapon. When McDilda's fabricated intelligence reached the Supreme War Council, it landed like a final crushing blow. War Minister Anami, the man who'd spoken so poetically about national destruction, stood before his colleagues with the weight of absolute defeat in his voice. 1 atomic bomb, he read from the interrogation report, could destroy 6 square miles, equivalent to 2,000 B-29s, each armed with 300 conventional bombs. The Americans appear to have 100 atomic bombs. The Americans appear to have 100 atomic bombs. They could drop 3 per day. The next target might well be Tokyo. The room was silent except for the sound of Admiral Suzuki's labored breathing. These men had commanded millions of soldiers, had orchestrated campaigns across the Pacific, had never known defeat. But they were facing a weapon that made their military expertise as obsolete as samurai swords in the age of machine guns. Still, incredibly, they remained deadlocked. 3 votes for surrender. 3 votes to continue fighting. It would take an intervention unprecedented in Japanese history to break the stalemate. Just before midnight on August 9th, 1945, something happened that hadn't occurred in over 1,000 years of Japanese history. Emperor Hirohito, the living god who traditionally remained above earthly decisions, entered a conference room and personally broke a government deadlock. The scene was unprecedented and surreal. The 6 members of the Supreme War Council, along with Baron Kichiro Hiranuma, knelt in formal positions around a polished table. The emperor, small in stature but carrying the weight of divine authority, spoke words that would end not just a war, but an entire way of thinking about warfare itself. "I have given serious consideration to the situation at home and abroad," Hirohito said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We must bear the unbearable and suffer what is insufferable." In that moment, Japan's military leaders faced the ultimate choice between honor and survival. Some, like Prime Minister Suzuki, accepted the new reality. Others, like General Anami, chose a different path. On August 15th, hours before the emperor's surrender broadcast, Anami performed ritual seppuku in his home. He died as he had lived, according to the warrior's code that atomic weapons had rendered obsolete. His final poem, written in his own blood, spoke of loyalty to the emperor and regret that he could not serve longer. He never acknowledged that the world had fundamentally changed. But perhaps the most tragic figure was Admiral Toyoda, who had so confidently declared that Americans couldn't have many atomic bombs. After the war, when the full scope of the Manhattan Project was revealed, when he learned that American industrial capacity had accomplished what Japanese scientists considered impossible, Toyoda reportedly spent hours staring at photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in complete silence. The atomic bombings didn't just end World War II. They marked the end of an entire military philosophy based on honor, sacrifice, and conventional warfare. Modern military planners study this story not just as history, but as a warning about the dangers of cognitive blindness in leadership. How expertise can become a prison. How professional knowledge can prevent leaders from recognizing revolutionary changes until it's too late. The Japanese military leadership in August 1945 made every decision based on what they knew to be true. Their scientists had told them atomic bombs were nearly impossible to produce in quantity. Their intelligence had confirmed it. Their experience supported it. And they were catastrophically wrong. Not because they were stupid or incompetent. These were some of the most brilliant military minds of their generation. They were wrong because they couldn't imagine that someone else had already changed the rules of the game. Today, as we face our own technological revolutions, artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, autonomous weapons systems, space-based capabilities, the story of Japan's military leadership in August 1945 remains painfully relevant. It reminds us that the greatest military disasters often come not from external enemies, but from internal inability to adapt to new realities. The Japanese military couldn't accept the atomic bomb's devastating power because they had convinced themselves it was impossible. Their scientific knowledge, their professional expertise, their cultural confidence, all became weapons used against them. They spent 3 days after Hiroshima debating whether to surrender, certain that America couldn't possibly have more bombs. They were proven wrong at 11:02 a.m. on August 9th when Nagasaki disappeared in atomic fire. Even then, even faced with the reality of 2 atomic bombs and a captured pilot claiming America had 100 more, they remained deadlocked. 3 votes for surrender. 3 votes to fight to national extinction. It took the personal intervention of a living god to break the stalemate. There's a photograph taken in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. Japanese officials in formal dress stand before a table, signing the instrument of surrender. Their faces show no emotion. The carefully controlled expressions of men performing a duty more painful than death. General Douglas MacArthur stands over them, representing the Allied powers. Behind him, ranks of American military officers watch in silence. What that photograph doesn't show is the journey those Japanese officials had taken to reach that table. The intellectual prison of expertise that had convinced them atomic bombs were impossible. The cultural commitment to honor that had made surrender unthinkable. The desperate hope that America was bluffing about having more bombs. All of it shattered by reality they couldn't accept until it was too late. 70,000 people died instantly in Hiroshima. Another 40,000 in Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands more would die in the following months and years from radiation sickness and injuries. How many of those deaths could have been prevented if Japan's military leadership had surrendered after Hiroshima? How many lives would have been saved if they'd accepted reality instead of clinging to expertise that blinded them to revolutionary change? We'll never know the answer to those questions, but we can learn from them. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you face on the battlefield. It's the certainty that you understand the rules of the game, even when someone else has already changed them forever. What lessons are you taking from this story? Have you seen examples in your own lifetime where expertise became a trap, where leaders couldn't accept new realities? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this examination of leadership technology and the courage to challenge our own assumptions valuable, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. History isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the present and preparing for the future.